Welcome to a special edition of the Global Jigsaw on the Ukraine grain deal. One of the key architects of it, Turkey's leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan, met Russia's Vladimir Putin early September in the Black Sea resort of Sochi in an effort to persuade him to rejoin after he pulled out in July. But the Russian leader gave him the cold shoulder. What are the implications for global food security?
If you're looking at a country like Somalia, for instance, they've had nearly 6 failed cycles of rainfall, and for a long time there had been a warning that there's a possible famine. Interestingly, Somalia gets nearly all of its grain from Ukraine.
Beverly Ochieng from BBC Monitoring's Nairobi team keeps a watch over some countries most desperate for Ukraine's grain. It is estimated that more than 50 million people across the African continent are currently in need of food aid because of successive years of failed rains.
So the vast majority of countries do rely both on Russia and Ukraine for their grain as well as fertilizer. Quite a number of African countries have been impacted as a result of the war. So you're looking at countries that have very little rain-fed agriculture like Somalia and countries in the Horn of Africa, countries that are also very agriculturally healthy but still need that additional supplement. So like Kenya, where I live, Uganda, Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, and in West Africa, countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, or even Niger that rely on these two countries. So it does mean that the vast majority of people will need to be supplemented to get food supplies.
This is a serious concern for other regions as well. Jada Taha is a colleague from our Cairo team who follows media in a number of countries in the Middle East.
Egypt relies heavily on wheat exports from both Russia and Ukraine. And since the war started, officially and in the media, the narrative has been kind of attributing the current ongoing economic crisis in the country to the war in Ukraine, including, of course, the food crisis and the increase in food prices and so on. The government has been trying to seek alternatives like India and most recently the UAE. Cairo was among other African countries that have called for Russia to resolve the food crisis.
Russia and Ukraine are both among the world's biggest suppliers of crops. But Moscow's full-scale invasion created profound security challenges for Kyiv's grain exports. This is why a deal was brokered by the UN in 2022, and it came with security guarantees from Russia for ships navigating in the northwestern part of the Black Sea.
When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, it essentially blocked Ukraine's ability to export grain through the Black Sea. And as a result, millions of people were at risk of starvation.
This is Margarita Malyukova from our Kyiv team.
This also caused world food prices to soar, and there was mounting international pressure on Russia to unblock Ukraine's ports. This was achieved in July 2022 when Ukraine and Russia struck a deal. And under this deal, a corridor was created to transport grain in the Black Sea. This corridor ran from the Bosporus to the Ukrainian ports of Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Pivdenny. Under the deal, almost 33 million tons of grain were shipped to various countries. And to give you an idea of how significant this is, the World Food Programme received more than 80% of all its grain from Ukraine over the past year, according to the EU. And it supplied this grain to countries like Afghanistan, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, and others.
But a year later, in July 2023, Russia left the deal, and with it, the security guarantees for Ukrainian grain ships.
Yes, Russia pulled out in July of this year, and it then started to launch missile attacks on Ukrainian grain infrastructure, port infrastructure. Around 60,000 tons of Ukrainian grain were actually destroyed in these missile attacks.
This was the cleanup after a missile attack in Odessa a few weeks ago. With its Black Sea ports disabled, Ukraine started to look for alternatives to bring its grain to the world.
Now, Ukraine can still transport some of its grain through land corridors in Europe and also through ports on the Danube, but this is quite difficult. And actually, in August, Ukraine's President Zelensky announced an alternative corridor for grain export in the Black Sea. This corridor goes through Ukrainian ports and then through Romanian territorial waters.
Вже 4 судна пройшли нашим новим альтернативним морським коридором із наших південних морських портів. І ми працюємо із нашими партнерами по всьому
According to
світу.
President Zelensky, 4 ships have already successfully used this corridor as of the 4th of September. But Zelensky also said that Ukraine needs air defense to ensure this route.
So that creates a substantial bottleneck on Ukrainian grain leaving the country, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed. It's much more difficult to export grain through alternative routes, but it's the option that Ukraine is exploring because, according to Ukrainian officials, it's very difficult to trust Russia and to go back to the grain agreement that existed.
Kyiv's lack of trust in Moscow to return to the deal is understandable. But the alternatives to the Black Sea route are few and far between, and they come with their own challenges. This is one of many attacks on the Ukrainian port of Reni by Russian drones. This city is only 200 meters across the Danube from NATO member Romania.
Sunteți din nou în Newsroom, doamnelor și domnilor, și avem o informație de breaking news. Bucăți dintr-o dronă rusească...
A few days ago, Romania's defense minister confirmed for the first time that parts of what could be a drone fell within the country's territory.
There were missile attacks on ports on the Danube, and just logistically, it's also harder, for example, to use land corridors in Europe because of the differences in the railway gauge between Ukraine and Europe.
This needs a bit of explanation. The countries of the former Soviet Union use a wider railway gauge than those in the rest of Europe, so the axles of every train load of grain need to be changed to fit the narrower gauge, and that's done manually. And there's another challenge, this one courtesy of some EU member countries.
Russia's pulling out of the Black Sea grain deal also coincided with additional restrictions on Ukrainian exports to Europe. And 5 EU countries, including Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, have restricted imports of Ukrainian agricultural products, primarily grain. Ukraine is now threatening to take legal action against these countries and the EU with the World Trade Organization. And there are also tensions between Ukraine and Poland because of this issue, Poland being one of Ukraine's biggest allies.
Clearly, the Black Sea is the best shipping route. But even when there was a deal, it was not smooth sailing. And this is reflected in the commentary Margarita's been seeing in Ukrainian media.
Росія не буде повертатися до зернової угоди. Президенти Туреччини та Росії провели переговори, однак ні про що не домовилися. Володимир Путін заявив, що Москва повернеться до
We did not see a lot of officials or media commenting on it because there was really a lot of skepticism about any further agreements with Russia. Ukraine's military intelligence issued a report where it concluded that even if Russia does go back to the grain agreement, it can still try to undermine it. There's really no point in going back to it. It's much easier to create alternative routes and to try to ensure them with the help of additional air defense and help from the West.
With its Black Sea fleet, Moscow's massive naval power spread out off Ukraine's shores. Russia is in control of the shipping, making Kyiv's grain exports very challenging. The Black Sea is crucial for Russia's own grain exports too. Jen Monaghan is from BBC Monitoring's Russia team.
70% of these exports come out of its Black Sea ports, things like wheat, barley, sunflower oil. So the Black Sea is a key area not just for Ukraine, but also for Russia.
International sanctions were placed on Russia since the start of the war. But the UN and Russia struck an agreement, parallel to the Ukraine Black Sea deal, removing some obstacles on Moscow's grain and fertilizer exports. So what needs to happen for Moscow to return to the deal that would enable Ukraine to export its grain?
Moscow's position is that the West was not fulfilling its end of the bargain in terms of removing barriers to the export of its own grain and sanctions against its own grain. And also Russia has been calling for its agricultural bank to be reconnected to the SWIFT payment system. Because of this issue in the Black Sea and because of the military presence there, things like insurance costs have gone up massively, and companies are not willing to send their own ships or lease ships to Russia.
It's a deadlock. Enter the man who since the start of the war has been wanting to play the role of the power broker. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan.
Değerli izleyenler, Cumhurbaşkanı Erdoğan ve Rusya Devlet Başkanı Vladimir Putin, Soçi'de dünyanın beklediği tahıl anlaşmasını konuştu.
Since the start of the invasion, Erdogan has sought to play a mediator's role. And Turkish pundits say Ankara is uniquely placed to bring the two sides together. Part of that is no doubt a sincere desire to bridge differences, but it also has the added benefit of boosting Turkey's international prestige in their eyes.
BBC Monitoring's William Armstrong tracks Turkish media from our office in Istanbul.
Turkey has very big ambitions for a greater global role. It's one of these so-called middle powers that are becoming increasingly influential in their regions through hard and soft power. A commentator in the pro-government Milliyet newspaper, Ozay Şendir, wrote about how meeting Putin in this way would make Erdogan an indispensable player at the upcoming G20 summit in Delhi, as other world leaders would then have to go through him to learn about Putin's intentions and conditions.
And of course, the grain deal is perfect because the stakes are so high. So many countries depend on it. The world's eyes are on it. So this is like a stage for him, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Turkish pro-government media coverage before the Sochi meeting saw it as this unique set-piece event, really, where Erdogan could persuade Putin to return to the grain deal and therefore burnish Erdogan's own prestige, demonstrating Turkey's international clout.
That's not how he's currently seen in Russia. Jen has the take from Russian state TV.
One of our duties at BBC Monitoring is to watch the Russian political talk shows on a daily basis. This gives us an insight into what narratives the Kremlin's pushing, given that state-controlled television is such an influential form of media in the country. One of these shows is called 60 Minutes. It's on Russia 1, which is the country's most popular television channel. And if we look at what 60 Minutes was saying about the Putin-Erdogan talks in advance of their taking place, then the host, Olga Skabeyeva, was portraying Erdogan as someone who could not be trusted. As an example of this, she recalled Turkey's participation in a prisoner swap deal last year, which saw 200 Ukrainian soldiers exchanged for a Kremlin ally in Ukraine.
This was seen by Moscow as a betrayal. It accused Ankara of breaking a promise to keep a group of key commanders in Turkey until the end of the war.
What was extremely painful for Russia in the aftermath of this prisoner swap was that Turkey handed over 5 members of what's called the Azov Battalion that Putin has a particular hatred of, frequently appear in sort of these narratives around Ukraine being a Nazi state. Anyway, Turkey handed over these 5 Azov commanders back to Ukraine, which Moscow said was in violation of the terms of the deal that it had brokered. Another example of this uneasy relationship between Ankara and Russia is the fact that Turkey has, earlier on in the conflict, supplied Bayraktar drones to Ukraine, which have been used by Ukrainian forces to strike Russian military targets in Ukraine.
In fact, the Bayraktars were so appreciated in Ukraine, there's even a chart-topping song about them.
If we were to characterise the relationship between Russia and Turkey, I think it could best be described as a marriage of convenience. Both sides have things that they dislike in the other, but they also have things that they can offer to one another. I think in the case of Putin and Erdogan, this is the fact that they're both strongman leaders.
Marriage of convenience, or a bromance between frenemies, whatever you want to call it, there's quite a baggage between the two that goes back a long way.
So Moscow and Ankara have a very complicated relationship, and they long have done. It combines cooperation with competition on multiple fronts since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Turkey's actually voiced support for Ukraine's full sovereignty, including over Crimea, as well as backing Ukraine's NATO membership. but it has not joined Western sanctions on Moscow, and it has in fact deepened already extensive trade and energy ties with Russia.
They both want to be seen as relevant and important players on the global stage. And in holding, let's say, these most recent talks in which they discuss the Ukrainian grain deal, this allows both Putin and Erdogan to present to their domestic audiences the fact that, look at me, I'm the main man here. For Putin, people want to come to Russia to speak to me. They need me and I'm relevant, and not just me, but Russia and you as Russians. Look at your strong country. Look at this great country that we all live in.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. How did media in Russia dish up the failure of the grain deal talks in Sochi?
The news bulletins that night following talks highlighted the camaraderie between Putin and Erdogan. They said that these talks were a sign that Turkish-Russian relationships were going from strength to strength. However, the actual grain deal itself was relegated to a bit of a footnote in the talks. It was downplayed. The talk shows the following day also downplayed the fact that any agreement could be reached at these talks, and in fact praised Putin for not bending to the will of the West or bending to Erdogan's will in signing up to rejoin this Ukrainian grain deal.
So the talks seem to have been more about projecting strength than achieving a deal. How did that go down?
We can look at social media, and the pro-war bloggers that we often monitor on there, again, are quite influential sources outside of state-controlled media in terms of what's happening in and around Ukraine. The pro-war bloggers largely welcomed the fact that no agreement had been reached. They saw this as Russia being strong in its resolve, a show of strength from Putin and a show of strength from Moscow.
The pro-war bloggers, they're getting a warm reception in the Kremlin, aren't they?
They really seem to have carved out a niche for themselves in this new post-Ukraine conflict media landscape in Russia, whereby the independent media have been chased out of the country. Telegram has emerged in its place as, given that it's one of the only social media platforms still operating in Russia, it's a place not only for opposition voices, but also pro-Kremlin voices. And these pro-war bloggers have got thousands, millions even, of subscribers, and they're offering another take on the war in Ukraine that's maybe not always heard on state media. And I think Putin's realised their power and influence. I mean, he's even hosted them, many influential bloggers, at a meeting in the Kremlin.
The meeting's failure to reach an agreement got a positive spin from the Turkish side too. Here's President Erdogan sounding upbeat about a possible solution in a short time.
Eksiklerin giderilerek girişimin devam ettirilmesi gerektiğine inanıyoruz. Bu konudaki görüşlerimizi değerli dostumla da.
The meeting obviously failed to live up to those lofty expectations, but that was largely overlooked in major Turkish media outlets. Instead, that coverage said the meeting indicated a light at the end of the tunnel and pointed to further talks. Erdogan paid lip service to Putin's suggestion of working with Turkey and Qatar to send Russian grain directly to African countries, saying Ankara is ready to do its part on this project, but not as an alternative to the original grain deal, which Turkey still wants to revive.
The negotiations aimed at securing safe passage for the desperately needed grain has been closely watched by those on the receiving end. Here's Beverly again.
When the deal initially collapsed, the strongest comment came from Kenya, which accused Russia of stabbing the continent in the back. And then, interestingly, that deal collapsed just after that African-led initiative to both Russia and Ukraine to be able to ensure that there was a mediation effort towards the war.
What Bev is referring to here is the African Peace Mission, led by Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. The delegation met both Ukrainian and Russian presidents in July.
And even though Cyril Ramaphosa, who'd led that negotiation, had said that he was optimistic, the fact that the grain deal collapsed felt like a slap in the face to that initiative. And then media commentary wasn't that widespread, although after a series of meetings between African journalists and the Ukrainian leader Zelensky, they were talking about how food has now become politicized. So it's become a way for, both Russia and Ukraine to try to win a footprint in the region. But the people who are suffering are the ones who are not going to be getting any access to food reserves anytime soon, as long as this war rages.
Putin said that Russia is ready, actually, to ship grain to 6 African countries free of charge, and that's apparently going to happen in the coming weeks.
Well, it's still a very small number if you're considering how many countries need it. So during the Russia-Africa Summit, he said that they would be able to give between 25,000 and I think about 50,000 tons of grain to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Mali, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea.
В ближайшие месяцы безвозмездно предоставить Буркина-Фасо, Зимбабве, Мали, Сомали, Центральноафриканской Республике, Эритрее по 25-50 тысяч тонн зерна.
Now, more than half of these countries are already Russia's surefire friends.
The Russian footprint in Africa has been steadily expanding at the expense of former colonial powers. Moscow has recently been relying on its friends when it comes to diplomatic arms wrestling.
We have Mali, the CAR, where there are Wagner mercenaries. You have Eritrea and Burkina Faso, which have backed Russia in various ways very publicly. In fact, Eritrea and Mali, for instance, are the only African countries that have backed Russia's war in Ukraine. Zimbabwe has been leaning towards Russia. It's abstained from UN votes. It also hosted one of Russia's biggest allies. With Somalia, it felt a bit like a wild card for Russia, and I think it's playing on the fact that there had been that famine warning. So Russia might be trying to win over political support, not necessarily from the administration in Mogadishu, because that's a very small, bargaining chip, but from others by showing that, he is keeping in mind a country that is vulnerable as Somalia and demonstrating, because we've seen Russia's argument throughout the war has been that the West is weaponizing food as a way of playing up the war in Ukraine.
While spin machines are in top gear to point fingers or project failure as win, many countries are left in limbo. Back to my conversation with William to try to understand Turkey's plan. What happens next?
I'm not sure. Perhaps this latest episode actually indicates the limits of Turkey's leverage over Russia and the limits of Erdogan's leverage over Putin, because ultimately any revival of the original grain deal is really down to Putin alone.
And how is that being received in Turkey? I mean, do people buy this or do we have other noises coming from, opposition media or social media?
I think the Turkish balancing act between Ukraine and Russia is quite popular on both sides of the aisle, actually. Pro-opposition coverage is also not really in favour of actually cutting off ties completely with Russia. There's a sense that Russia, as a neighbour of Turkey, has the potential to really damage Turkey's interests regionally. So therefore, I think Turkey is going to continue to try and play this balancing role. The attempt to mediate between Ukraine and Russia is a very crowded market. A lot of countries want to do it. In the past, we saw Israel trying to play this role. We've seen more recently Saudi Arabia hosted an international conference to mediate, to bring together countries on this issue. And there are a number of other players. We've already mentioned Qatar. All these players want to play this kind of constructive international role to mediate between the two sides and ultimately to bring them together. From the very start of the war, Turkey's wanted to play that role. So the idea that Turkey's now just going to give up doing that when there's these other competitive players trying to do the same thing is not really realistic.
Qatar seems to be the new kid on the mediation block. This hasn't been officially confirmed by Doha, but Jada in our Cairo office tells us what she's been observing.
Qatar always praises itself and its role to be helping different nations, especially the less developed. They've also previously tried to offer mediation between Kyiv and Moscow. The Qatari Emir and the foreign minister paid separate visits to Moscow over the past year. And more recently, the Qatari foreign minister was on an unannounced visit to Ukraine on 28 July. The foreign ministry then said that the goal of the visit was to diffuse tensions and address the humanitarian repercussions of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. And it also said at the same time that the visit aims to support efforts of extending the grain deal in the interest of global food security.
It may seem that it's all in Putin's hand, as William was saying earlier, but we have seen Erdogan's persuasion powers in this relationship in the past. Final thoughts from our Russia watcher, Jen.
Well, I think it's a win-win situation for Putin insofar as domestically he can portray himself as being a relevant, important global player. Other countries in the West, in the global South, have to come to Putin they have to involve him in talks if they want any resolution on the grain issue. In July, there was a Russia-Africa summit. Leaders such as South African President and the Egyptian President had gone to Putin, asking Putin publicly, please rejoin this grain deal. We're suffering as a continent and as individual countries. This didn't really lead anywhere. Instead, Putin announced to great fanfare that Moscow was willing to supply grain free of charge to 6 African countries. However, he never really goes into specifics. It's all very vague.
Со своей стороны, Россия, несмотря на все чинимые препоны, намерена продолжать экспортировать продовольствие и удобрения.
It remains to be seen if they do, in fact, get finalised or if it's just words to grab positive headlines in Russia.
So Russia isn't holding all the cards. And in fact, there's one image I remember from the start of the war of this Russian warship. It was a flagship of the Russian Navy, and it was there waiting at the Bosphorus before the war started. And it waited there for 9 months before it eventually turned away and sailed back to Vladivostok. Turkey is the gatekeeper of the Black Sea. It can close its straits. So Erdogan does have a strong card to play in his negotiations with Russia.
I think this is a really interesting facet of this uneasy relationship between Putin and Erdogan. Turkey, in accordance with a 1936 international treaty, has full sovereignty over the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, which are the only outlets of water running from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The Black Sea for Russia is such a strategic location. If we think about Russia's other ports across the country, well, in the north, the waters are frozen at times of the year. Vladivostok, it's on the other side of the country. Again, there's issues around access and supply. You know, it's extremely far away from Moscow. I think it's 7 time zones away. So obviously, logistically, that brings its own difficulties. So the Black Sea really is such an important strategic body of water for Russia, and not just militarily. Of course, it has its Black Sea fleet based in Crimea now, but also in terms of trade. Russia ships 70% of its grain exports out of its Black Sea ports. The fact that Turkey has sovereignty over the very strip of water that leads from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and from there out to Africa, the Middle East. Putin will be aware of this, and it's probably always in the back of his mind when he's having these negotiations with Turkey. We've seen short-term spats, they're often resolved, and I think it's because Putin realises the geopolitical importance of maintaining access at all times through these straits to the Mediterranean Sea.
Be well, have a nice trip, we'll be in touch. Putin's parting words to Erdogan in Sochi. Thank you to Beverly Ochieng, Margarita Maliukova, Jen Monaghan, Jada Taha, and William Armstrong. This was a special edition of the Global Jigsaw, and we will keep you posted on news about our upcoming Season 2. In the meantime, do catch up with previous episodes you might have missed and subscribe so you don't miss an edition. That's all from us, producer Krista Shaturi, sound engineer Brendan Gormley, editor Judy King, and me, Krassi Twig.